Oh, great. Okay. So, good morning, everyone. We're trying to learn the life and thoughts of the Baal Shem Tov. I last week in the last year, I sort of contextualized the Baal Shem Tov as both finding his place within world history, within Jewish history, a time of upheaval, a time of spiritual seeking, a time of people perhaps turning to mysticism for comfort and meaning. And really, in many ways, we can say he was the right person at the right time. Chassidus wouldn't have happened without this remarkable and exceptional and unusual figure. And on the other hand, the reception that the world was ripe for his insights and his innovations. We contextualized him also as part of a Baal Shem tradition, and yet on the other hand, completely unique. He wasn't just a faith healer, he wasn't just a preacher who went from town to town. He was an innovator who offered exceptional meaning and understanding and insight to people in a way that no one else did. And as a result, within 50 years of his death, 50% of Russian and Polish Jewry are Chassidim. This is a revolution that just bursts forth with enormous energy and controversy, and of course we'll get to that later. We spoke about the idea that he himself didn't write. We only have very few things directly from him. In fact, just a couple of letters. So little that sort of extreme academics questioned his existence at all, which was an untenable and ridiculous position to take. But we really know very little about him as a person. Most of what we know of his teachings are from his students, primarily the Maggid of Mezeritch, who taught his Torah verbally, orally, and was, if you like, the architect, the engineer of his movement. He took it from being a startup into a large structured organization with rebbes in different regions. That was the work of the Maggid, a remarkable student of the Baal Shem Tov. And his other student, the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Panaya, who wrote and cites his great Rebbe more than 800 times directly, and an accurate citing. In other words, besides him being an Odom Gadol and therefore having reliability in his own right, he records this I heard directly, this I heard indirectly, here I remember the specific words, here I don't remember the specific words, this I heard from someone who was quoting him to me. So there's every indication in the work that this was a student who took great pains to ensure that he was citing his great teacher accurately and appropriately. Finally, we contextualize the Baal Shem Tov as being part of a Kabbalistic tradition and an innovator and a publicizer of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic ideas. Now, what do we know about his life? The answer is very little. And much of what we know is lost in legends. He was one of these figures who was so awe-inspiring and so amazing that stories were told about him within his own lifetime, and after his lifetime, his reputation spread very far, very fast, and we really know very little about him. We have fragments of records from contemporaries who were amazed by him, of contemporaries who were horrified by what he was saying, and we have fragments of records from his students who mention here and there odd biographical details. We have some contemporary references, as I said, but we really don't know much. There was a work published a couple of generations after his death called the Shivchei Abesht, the praises of the Baal Shem Tov. It's openly a hagiographic work. That means it's openly a work of praise by someone who's awestruck by the Baal Shem Tov. This was written by the son-in-law of a scribe of the Baal Shem Tov. So someone who had access to first-hand stories of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov had a secretary, a scribe to whom he used to dictate things and notes and ideas and write letters and so on. So it's quite a common feature at the time that a leader, a rabbinic leader, would have a scribe. And the son-in-law of the scribe collected legends and stories of the Baal Shem Tov. So Shivchei Baal Shem Tov is one of these works that contains truths, but we don't know if it contains the whole truth, and we don't know if it contains only truths. It was written really 2 generations after the Baal Shem Tov, but carries some information about him. What can we say about the Baal Shem Tov? Well, he was born in 1698, or maybe he wasn't. He's definitely born sometime around then, but we don't really know exactly. That's the generally given date, 1698. His name was Rabbi Yisroel ben Eliezer, and his mother was called Sarah, or maybe she wasn't. Again, we don't really know. But I just want to say, I'm going to tell you the story of his life, but we really know very, very little about this. He was born in West Ukraine, probably, And we have the name of a town, Okopi, where he's supposedly born. Again, we don't know much about that. There are legends about his parents. It is a fact that he became an orphan at a young age, that we do know. Perhaps as early as 1703, in which case he was maybe 5 at the time. And there are a number of legends or stories about why he became orphaned, but he became orphaned from both his parents. Possibly his parents were very elderly, according to tradition, when he was born, and there's miracle stories attached to his birth to these very elderly parents, if that's the case. Again, I can't emphasize enough, we really don't know much about this. It seems that, as I said, he did become an orphan, and he was adopted by the Jewish community of Tlust, which gave him a basic education to Cheder level, and as far as we understand, he didn't receive a formal education higher than that. So he didn't learn in a formal yeshiva or the like. One of the ideas associated with the Baal Shem Tov is that he was a revolutionary. By the way, here I'm leaving his biography for a moment. And part of his revolution seems to have been, supposedly, glorifying the spirituality of the simple man. So the later Hasidic generations argued that Rabbinic Judaism, classic Judaism, Litvish Judaism had become over-elitist. The leadership were Talmidei Chachomim, who by definition had received years of education and prominence. Rabbinic positions were often inherited, father to son. To receive years of rabbinic education, you had to have money or access to money. The rabbinic elite, the great promising students, would become sons-in-law of wealthy people, and therefore you had a sort of aristocracy that was established, and Chassidus was there to sort of restore a balance of power to simple people. A lot of Chassidic stories were pressing raw spirituality at the expense of over-legalistic, over-elitist sort of practices. So a classic Hasidic story would tell the story of a simple shepherd boy who in one version enters the shul on Yom Kippur and is very moved to spirituality and begins chanting the Aleph base because that's the only Torah they know, and that the townspeople want to shush this kid who's disturbing the tefillah, and the Rav, perhaps an early Hasidic leader, or Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem Tov himself, says, no, that God is combining these letters of the Aleph base into a tefillah that's more meaningful than all your prayers. All your prayers were being blocked by the satanic forces, and the innocent cry of this pure soul of this neshama, of this shepherd boy, is piercing the heavens and is having a greater impact. So the point of the story is that you snobbish town people, elitist town people, are disturbed by the simple shepherd boy singing their stories and interrupting the flow of the chazan, but realize there's greater spirituality found in the innocence and depth of the shepherd boy. In another version of the story, the shepherd boy doesn't sing the Aleph base, doesn't even know the Aleph base. He blows on his whistle, his shepherding whistle, a simple tune. And here, certainly, the townspeople are really horrified because you're not allowed to blow a whistle on Yom Kippur. And nonetheless, the Rebbe, Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem Tov, perhaps himself, says this prayer coming from the innocence of the heart. Here we have a hint at a second Hasidic theme in which they're open to spirituality, even when it's in breach of ostensible halacha. Right, so this is known in philosophy as antinomianism, against the law. The idea that, at least on occasion, with a lot of caution, with a lot of care, you can even breach halacha to achieve raw spirituality. And then we'll revisit these later. Are these true claims? Or is this accurate presentation of early Chassidus or not? We'll come to all the controversy surrounding that. But certainly this is the image that the next generation of Chassidim project, that people see them as saying, and the opponents of Chassidim latch onto. Now, in this narrative, the Baal Shem Tov wasn't part of the rabbinic elite, and perhaps he himself was this sort of simple boy who never achieves a high education. Maybe he becomes a mystic and a Kabbalist, but not a Talmudist and a halachist, because classic leaders are Talmudists and halachists, and he isn't. He's this sort of revolutionary who's creating a new model of leadership. And the traditional stories of the Baal Shem Tov sort of feed into that, in which he was an orphan who was raised by the community, given a cheder education, and nothing more than that. And again, as recently as 20, 30 years ago, this was the standard narrative. And again, the academics believed this narrative because it sort of fed into the revolutionary fervor of the sort of Hasidic movement. And the Hasidim didn't believe he was Chas v'Shalom and Amoritz. He was clearly a master Kabbalist, but it's sort of, they definitely would buy into the idea that somehow he wasn't part of the classic hierarchical elitist structure, rabbinic structure. And they believed, of course, he was learned and a great person, but not a Talmudist necessarily, not a halachist, or if he was, that wasn't his interest and his preoccupation, and he didn't belong to the establishment. We now know that's not true. Again, Rossman and his research and various other sources, collating sources that some of them were around all the time but not noticed, we know this isn't true. And therefore, even though, as far as we can tell, he was never part of a formal yeshiva program, and indeed it is correct that he was orphaned at a young age and only given a cheder education, he somehow or other did achieve a classic education, and in his life was to a degree part of the rabbinic elite. He wasn't the Rav of a city necessarily, or a town, but within the town in which he lived, he was sort of considered a Talmud Chacham. He was brought into halachic questions and so on. We'll see a source about that later. So what do we know of his biography so far? He was orphaned young, educated in a cheder, and as far as we can tell, never had a formal rabbinic training later than that, but somehow achieved a considerable mastery of nigla and halachic learning, also not just nista. So he was an autodidact, or he found education. He was clearly a brilliant person, and he achieved. Again, there were questions. Did he know even how to write classic rabbinic Hebrew and the like? And we know the answer to all these questions now. Yes, he absolutely did. You can see from his writing, he's just a well-trained scholar. Okay. Where did he learn Kabbalah from? Again, we don't really know. In classic Hasidic legends, he learnt from a hidden tzaddik, a hidden Kabbalist, called Reb Adam Baal Shem. So the first generations of Chassidim formed themselves into sort of Kabbalistic study groups, study circles. We can almost call them a chabura or the like. And early Hasidic thinkers sort of projected onto the Baal ShemTov a similar sort of idea, and they believed there were these underground study circles of Kabbalists conveying Kabbalistic secrets secretly, and he sort of was inducted into one of these groups by a figure called Reb Adam Baal Shem. Again, we mentioned there were Baalei Shem floating around. There were Kabbalists wandering around the Jewish scene at the time, all the way from Germany in the west through to Ukraine in the east. And there were study circles of Kabbalists. There was known often as a kloiz. A kloiz is a Yiddish word for a sort of a study group, coming linked to the secular word cloister, to be cloistered away, or the sort of church cloisters and so on. So there were cloises of a little bit like a kollel, you could call it nowadays. So basically, these were Talmidei Chachamim funded by the community who didn't have rabbinic positions, but learnt into a mature age, into an advanced age, even after they were married, continued to learn. And some of these cloises were circles of Kabbalah. What do we know about the Baal Shem's supposed Kabbalistic Rebbe, Reb Adam Baal Shem? Zero. Absolutely nothing. We don't know anything about him. We have no records of him. We know nothing at all. I say supposed teacher of the Baal Shem because, again, these are only second and third generation reports of his teacher. They're not first generations. These aren't people that say they heard directly from the Baal ShemTov about this teaching. So we know nothing about Reb Adam Baal Shem. He's supposed to come from a place called Ropshitz. He's supposed to have had this secret Kabbalistic organization called Machaneh Yisroel. But we really don't know anything about him at all. There's been a lot of speculation. There was a known Kabbalist in Troyes, in France, who moved later to East Europe, who was known as Reb David Moshe Avram, and he was a Baal Shem. And the initials of David Moshe Avram rearranged to make Adam, the word Adam. So there are those that speculate that this is who he was. But we know nothing, absolutely nothing about him, including we don't know for certain whether he existed. The Chernobyl Ukrainian Hasidic dynasty uses the name Adam in their family. It's a name. It's not such a common used Hebrew name. There are not that many people who are called Adam in their Hebrew name. There are some, and they do use this name, and they claim that they are descendants of this Adam Baal Shem. So difficult to know. Reb Adam Baal Shem, according to the Hasidic chain of tradition, was a Talmud, a student of someone called Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem. Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem is known about. He existed. He lived in Zamosk. He was known as a healer, a faith healer, and a miracle worker. And he again is a figure who's known. He was a Talmid of the Bach. He learned for several yeshivas in Rabbi Yoel Sarki's, the students of the Bach. So he's someone who's a sort of known figure in the world of Nigla, of revealed Torah. Also, he set up a yeshiva in Ostra in Ukraine. He was a co-rosh yeshiva with his son, who was called Reb Uri. Reb Uri was a Talmid of the Taz. Again, another posek commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So once we get to the next generation of supposed tradition, Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem, these are known figures. I mention this simply to show how the Baal Shem movement was around, and often these were establishment figures who were known, Rosh Yeshivas and so on at the same time. Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem was a student of someone called Reb Eliyahu Baal Shem. Again, Reb Eliyahu Baal Shem is a known figure, born in Germany, operating in Worms, running away in a moment, I'll tell you why, to East Europe, to Krakow, to Chelm, to Prague. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Worms initially, and he had to run away because of opposition to his publicizing Kabbalah. And this is a theme that we're going to get to later, because part of the opposition to Chassidus is that Chassidus is publicizing Kabbalah, and Kabbalah shouldn't be publicized. Kabbalah is not meant to be learnt on a mass level. Kabbalah is secret. These shouldn't be learnt by regular people. And according to this tradition, as it were, the Baal ShemTov is a student of a student of a student of someone who 150 years earlier is caught up in controversy about publicizing Kabbalah. Okay, so definitely the Baal Shem Tov is being associated with known Kabbalistic circles, figures who to some degree are known, even though we don't know an awful amount about them. Either way, the Baal Shem seems to spend some time in his life in Cheder. He seems to get some form of more advanced Torah learning, at least in Kabbalah. And he, at a very young age, is employed as a teaching assistant in Cheder, according to the story. So he finishes his Cheder education at Bar Mitzvah, and he's penniless. He's an orphan. He's a drain and a burden on the community. He has to work hard in order to earn his living, and he's appointed as a shamash in the local Cheder, as a sort of assistant to the Melamed, a TA to the Melamed, and he gradually is promoted and becomes a teacher of children, according to the story. Again, this feeds into the Hasidic idea that he's a sort of loving figure who's happy to teach children. He's not someone who's looking for sort of a high and elevated rabbinic position, and so on. There is a quote from the Maggid and Mezeritch, who's a direct student, that indicates that he was at some stage a teacher of children, because the Maggid of Mezeritch speaks about his great love for his students. That the Baal Shem Tov he said if we kissed the Sefer Torah like the Baal Shem Tov kissed the students of his in Cheder, then that would be a great connection and to Torah and so on. So he was a loving teacher. According to Hasidic tradition, the Baal Shem Tov began having mystical experiences at a young age. We will later see a first-hand account, which is an amazing account. I think I mentioned this already last week, in which the Baal Shem Tov writes in his famous holy epistle, Geras HaKodesh, he writes a letter describing his own mystical experiences. He definitely was a mystic, but mystical experiences absolutely unbelievable. But according to Hasidic tradition, at a very young age, he began having these revelations. And for reasons that I don't know and haven't seen discussed, the mystical teacher that he achieved his revelations from was Achia HaShaloni. So Achia HaShaloni is a Nach figure, a prophet, mentioned in Tanakh. He's part of the chain of tradition. If you look, for example, at the Rambam's introduction to Mishnah Torah, the Rambam lists the chain of tradition, and Achia HaShaloni is sort of one of the generations of Jewish leaders. He's less well known than Shmuel or Eliyahu, but he's a sort of known tradition, a known figure in the Masorah, and a prophet. And I don't know why, and I haven't managed to find in any Chassidish forum, there probably are out there, but I haven't found why the Baal Shem Tov somehow felt himself linked to this figure. But according to the tradition, he began having mystical revelation from Achia HaShaloni. This prophet, the neshama of this prophet, came and taught him Torah. According to, as far as we can understand, the Baal Shem Tov at this point married, and a young age we're talking about, he's maybe 18 at the time, Ben Shimon Asar Chuppah. So according to the classic timeline, it's 17, 16. He marries, and we don't know much about his first wife, who tragically passed away quite young. According to Hasidic tradition, sometime around now, he is wandering around Ukraine, West Ukraine, East Galicia, and begins accumulating students. And at this point, we begin shifting from the realm of legends to the realm of historical facts a little bit more clearly, though even this is very, very murky. At some point or other, he seems to have become a Dayan, or at least being used as a Dayan, even though he may not be a formal member of a Beis Din. So he's wandering around eastern Ukraine. He's going to visit market towns at the time the markets are going on, and he seems to have been asked by people to be a mediator or arbitrator in Dinei Torah. So he evidently has some knowledge of Choshen Mishpat. I feel uncomfortable speaking in a sense at this point because we know so little about him, but I want to emphasize we're talking about one of the most remarkable people in Jewish history, one of the greatest people in Jewish history. So I'm simply using this term because we know so little. And when I say he seems to have had some knowledge of Choshen Mishpat, I don't in any way, chas v'shalom, mean that as a limitation of him. We're talking about someone who impacted Jewish history more than anyone else, perhaps in the last 400-500 years, and founded a movement that is probably now already a majority of the Orthodox world, and if not, we're close to the tipping point. I think I mentioned last week that it seems that the majority of Anglo-Jewish Orthodoxy is now Chassidish. In the last 5-10 years, that switch happens. So we're talking about one of the most remarkable figures in Jewish history. I'm simply using this language to say that we know very little about him, not in chas v'shalom in any way to be disrespectful in the least. But he seems to, as I say, have functioned as an arbitrator, not an official dayan in the Beis Din, but effectively being used by people. What is a fact is he makes a very, very choshev shidduch at this point, and he marries the daughter of Rebbe Ephraim of Brody. I mentioned that there are cloises around, study circles with great leaders in, and one of these great Kabbalistic sages is Rabbi Ephraim of Brody, who later goes on to achieve fame and prominence, and the Baal ShemTov marries his daughter. Now, we would argue that is indication that he is a prominent figure who becomes part of the rabbinic elite. So even though his upbringing is humble and he only has a cheder education, by this time he's entered into the rabbinic elite. There are Hasidic stories against that version. According to the Hasidic stories, Rabbi Ephraim of Brody meets a figure who he has no idea who he is. He's enormously impressed by him. He leaves a letter in which he says that this figure should be allowed to marry his daughter. The Baal ShemTov turns up with that letter and to claim the hands of his wife, and there's opposition to this. This daughter has the Baal ShemTov has a brother-in-law. This daughter has a brother called Gershon of Kitov, who's very opposed to the Baal ShemTov. He can't believe that his sister is going to be married to an Am Ha'aretz, and the Baal ShemTov is pretending to be an Am Ha'aretz, and nonetheless the marriage takes place, and the Baal ShemTov is still undercover, fitting into the sort of hidden Tzadikim narrative and so on. All of this we don't have any evidence for, and maybe retroactive rewriting in order to sort of fit the image of the Baal ShemTov not being part of the rabbinic elite. Again, till 20 years ago, this was taken more seriously. Nowadays, we don't think this is the case. He made this choshev shidduch, and the records that we have of his communication with his brother-in-law Gershon Kitova are very, very friendly and warm. There doesn't seem to be tension there. So at least at some later stage, Gershon Kitova understood that his brother-in-law was a great figure and treats him with great respect. So it is clear that to some degree the Baal Shem is undercover. He doesn't seek a rabbinic position. He puts himself into a backwater where he settles, but he is somewhat mingling with the leadership at the time. He's not a completely anonymous figure. Okay, so either way, whether undercover as a tzaddik nista or whether overtly he marries into a choshev rabbinic family, and but then again seems to not take a prominent position. He wanders around the Carpathian mountains. According to legends, he engages in menial labor. He digs clay and lime and sells it, and eventually has children, at least 2 children, daughter Udal and a son Svi Hirsch. Again, we'll come back to these figures later because we'll see that in the first generation of Hasidus, there isn't dynastic inheritance, like later became the fact. In fact, the Chassidim criticize the non-Chassidic rabbinic roles for having inheritance of positions. Reb Tzvi Hirsch does not become the successor. He's a great man, but doesn't become the successor of the Baal Shem Tov to the Chassidic movement. And Udal achieves fame because she becomes the ancestress of the Breslov Chassidic. Well, there's no dynasty there because Reb Nachman of Breslov dies childless. Becomes the ancestor of the Reb Nachman of Breslov. Okay, what's the continuation of the Baal Shem Tov's life? He's married now. He's wandering around the Carpathian Mountains. He seems to spend time as a shochet, and we'll see later that he seems to have expertise in Hilchos Treifus. We'll come to that. One of the most important areas of rabbinic practice in the past was to know treifus, right? You are Rav of a little shtetl, and someone shechts a cow, and there's a perforation in the lung of the cow. Is the cow treif or not? The Rav has to paskin. That's like a basic aleph base part of the rabbinic role. The cow is enormously valuable. You can't be mekel and chas v'shalom irresponsibly lenient and let people eat non-kosher food. On the other hand, you can't be machmir and irresponsibly stringent and in an impoverished world discard an animal of extreme worth. And Baal Shem Tov is still wandering around. He seems also to be operating as a Baal Shem, as a healer. We'll come back to evidence that I mentioned later for that. And at some point or other, he seems to be able to settle down in Mezeritch, in a little village called Mezeritch. I mentioned also earlier that the Baalei Shem found it difficult to settle down. There were at least two sorts of wandering rabbinic leaders in the past. A Rav was employed by the town, a Shochet was employed by the town, a Chazan and a Moil were employed by the town. You have a small Jewish settlement, an impoverished shtetl. They need those roles in order to be able to function. Better still, if you could find one person who can be the Rav, the Chazan, the Shochet, and the Moil, and the Sofer, and he could do everything. But you need those roles for a village, a shtetl, to function. There were wandering figures called Maggid, who were rebukers, who were darshonim. They would wander around, and their job was very difficult. They didn't have tenure. They didn't have a position, and they would wander around. And very often they would be welcome in a town for a small amount of time. The town would give them some money, but no one wants them hanging around too long because they're a drain on the town's resources. Similarly, there were Baalei Shem wandering around. They would turn up in town. Everyone would flock to them to get kamias and amulets and to get advice about herbs and healing and the like. And maybe these people also studied secular, as it were, medicine. Maybe they would become teachers of the great Ukrainian, non-Jewish Ukrainian healers and the like. We have instances in which Baalei Shem pack themselves off even to university towns like Padua in Italy to study medicine, and they come back and they're medicinal faith healers of sorts, and they wander around the towns of the area. And again, no one wants them to stay too long. The fact that the Baal Shem Tov is able to settle in Mezeritch as a Baal Shem, not as a Rav, he's not the Rav of the town, indicates that he has enough followers and enough sort of financial security that he's able to do this. So again, this is all Rossman's research, but it seems the fact that he can now settle down and stop wandering around indicates that he's gathered around him followers who are willing to finance him. In some ways, we could argue that this is one of the innovations of the Hasidic community, in that it systemizes a separate type of spiritual leadership to the rabbi of the town. And this is a spiritual innovation and also the cause of some of the politics against Hasidim, because you now have two leadership roles often in the town, both the Rav and the Tzaddik. We'll come to this later, but in a sense, on a sort of sociological level, till that point, there's only sort of two or three ways of achieving Jewish leadership prominence, and Chassidus innovates another way of prominence. How to become a leader in the Jewish world up to that point? Money. Money is always a good way to get leadership. If you're wealthy, then you have influence and power, obviously. If you are Talmud Chacham, you have influence and power. And if you have yichus, you have influence and power. Each one has its own different flavor of influence and power. But these are sort of three ways of prominence. Very often the three ways overlap with each other because in order to achieve high-level Talmudic status, you have to learn in yeshiva for a long time, in which case you need someone who's going to support you, and therefore you need a wealthy father or eventually father-in-law, and yichus often, again, it attracts shidduchim and therefore attracts money and so on. So you have this sort of elite alliance between the three. I don't mean, again, in any way to be cynical about this. I'm just stating a sort of sociological fact. And that there are many, many great rabbinic leaders who don't have these and persevere. A Rabbi Kiva sort who eventually manages to flourish and rise to the top. But no, chas v'shalom in any way to be cynical about the system. But humans are humans, and there is a sort of sociological pattern at work also over here. And this is sort of a feature of life till then. The figures who are inspirational tzaddikim, but aren't interested in taking a sort of formal position, a stella, are stuck. And they end up, as we said, these Maggidim or these small time sort of Kabbalists and so on. Many of you may have been very great figures, but didn't have a sort of role or a position. A larger town maybe also needed a Dayan, but that was it really. The part of the innovation of Chassidus is to establish a permanent fixture in the town in which someone achieves prominence not through their Talmudic learning, though they were in many cases great Talmudic scholars, they were great Talmudists, but through their spiritual message, being a tzaddik. This is the sort of Chassidish term for the Rebbe. The Rebbe is the tzaddik. Through their great tzidkus, they achieve a sort of new sort of leadership role. And in some way or other, the fact that the Baal ShemTov is able to establish himself in Mezeritch indicates that he has become somewhat of an established spiritual leader, and that without being a formal Rav of the town, he has a role as a tzaddik, as the spiritual leader of the town. Now, this is more or less where the Baal Shem Tov spends his remaining years. His circle of influence goes around the area that he's been traveling, Podolia, Vilna, that's these are all sorts of regions around the area. And his fame begins spreading. And again, it's difficult to stress enough how false the narrative is that his circle of followers are sort of revolutionary figures and the like. They are absolutely not. He attracts to himself followers who are mainstream Talmidei Chachomim, mainstream poskim. Again, the idea has now been very, very soundly debunked and should have been obvious through all the generations. It's very, very clear when you learn the early Hasidic works that these are massive Talmidei Chachomim, these are mainstream figures, and yet for differing reasons, both Hasidus and academics and the opponents of Chassidim wanted to de-emphasize that. The opponents of Chassidim wanted to de-emphasize it because they wanted to say these are Amaratzim. This is this sort of dangerous revolutionary movement that isn't sort of reliable and so on. And the Chassidim, to a degree, emphasized this because they wanted to say we're revolutionaries who are sort of creating a new type of spirituality. They were revolutionaries. They were creating a new type of spirituality in some respects, but these are mainstream rabbinic figures, Rabbonim of very, very chashuv towns in the region, well-known Mechabrei Sfarim, Dayanim. These are very, very prominent figures. And the Chassidim, the followers, not yet called Chassidim, the followers, these people inspired by the Baal Shem Tov begin flocking to this backwater of Mezeritch to be taught Torah from him. The two most prominent Talmidim of the Baal Shem that we've spoken about before, the Maggid of Mezeritch and Toldos Yaakov Yosef, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Baal, are both rabbinic figures, very, very learned, Rabbonim of chashuv towns. These are not sort of antinomian figures. I'm not going to go through all the names of his early students, but these are serious Talmidei Chachamim who are impressed by the mysticism of the Baal Shem Tov and impressed by his teachings. I'll mention now just very briefly one other area, or two other areas in which we see the Baal Shem Tov as being part of the rabbinic elite in a sense. The first is he is, according to legends, again, we don't know much historic records of this, but according to legends, the Baal Shem Tov is one of the representatives of the Jewish people in a debate with the Frankists. So here we'll just step back for a little bit of more Jewish history. All I want to bring out from this story is that when Jews are forced to debate opponents of Judaism, you choose your best, most knowledgeable representative to represent you. You don't choose a sort of hippie living in a desert with twigs caught up in their hair. If the Baal Shem Tov is chosen to represent, amongst other Jewish leaders, the Jewish community in a debate with the Frankists, he clearly isn't a mystic who can't string two words together. He's clearly someone who's eloquent, who's powerful. Again, I feel embarrassed speaking this way. It should have been obvious to everyone, all of this. But there's so, I can't emphasize enough how much sort of, in the same way as there's skepticism about Hasidic legends, there's so much academic legends associated with this. For years, for so long, he was sort of presented as this countercultural figure, and he clearly wasn't that. Though maybe on an intellectual level, there was so much that was countercultural about him, but he's also part of, okay, so who does he go to debate? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. He engaged in healing. He may have had some secular knowledge of healing. I don't know. I don't know. But in a minute, though, I'll explain to you what language this debate was. Okay, we don't know much about this debate. All I will say is as follows. The Sabbatean movement is not that long dead. Shabtai dies in 1676. He converted to Islam much earlier, but he has followers still, remarkably, who believe that he is Mashiach and more. Theology begins developing around him in which he's almost the embodiment of God and the like. Now, we really need a series on Shabtai Tzvi himself. But all I will say is that Shabtai Tzvi has a very dangerous piece of theology, in which he argues for a version of Avera Lishma. And we're going to come back to this term later. But basically, he argues for the idea that you can do something profoundly sinful and evil, and that can have spiritual benefit. Chassidim are later going to be accused of the same doctrine, and there may be on a much, much, much more subtle level some truth to that claim. We'll have to get back to that. But Shabtai takes this all the way. It's awful. And by the end of Shabtai Tzvi's pre-conversion era, he is leading mass eating on Yom Kippur, this new bracha that he's created, Mate Isurim. We say Mate Asurim, Hashem frees those who are imprisoned. He creates a bracha, Mate Isurim, the one who allows Isurim. He argues that with the coming of Mashiach, all classic halacha has been removed, shades of other messianic movements over here. Okay, so it becomes very, very poisoned by the end. This theology allows followers of Shabtai Tzvi to continue to believe in him even after he is converted to Islam. So again, we're not here to talk about the whole life of Shabtai Tzvi, but the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire realized this is a growing problem. He very cleverly decides not to kill Shabtai Tzvi because then he will become martyred and perhaps go on again like another messianic movement, that the martyred founder of their movement goes on to become more powerful in death than in life, as occurred in Christianity. He decides instead to basically hold a sword to his head and force him to convert to Islam, which Shabtai Tzvi does, and believes this will end the movement, and it does by and large. Meaning to say that Shabtai Tzvi, who perhaps the majority of the Jewish world is impressed by, now becomes a fringe figure. But nonetheless, the movement persists beneath the surface, and they can justify his conversion based upon this doctrine of Avera Lishma. And there are underground circles of Sabbateans for probably another 200 years and even more. Now, this creates tremendous controversy in Europe, in which people are being accused left, right, and center of being Sabbateans. The famous Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz controversy, a terribly tragic controversy. Allah is accused of being a Sabbatean. Chassidim are later going to be accused of being Sabbateans. Anyone who is engaging in mystical practice is suspicious. People are suspicious of them being Sabbateans. There are also other groups of Sabbateans. For example, there's a group that, along with Shabtai Tzvi, convert to Islam, but remain undercover Jews and Sabbateans. And to the best of our knowledge, they exist to this day. There are Jews living in Turkey who to this day, or Muslims living in Turkey, who to this day have undercover Sabbatean tendencies. Absolutely amazing. There's definitely record of them until the First World War. It's an amazing time of history if you're interested in these things. And there's some evidence that they still exist to this day. There is a new movement that arises in the Jewish world in East Europe, founded by a terrible fellow called Jacob Frank. It's called the Frankist movement. He claims to be a reincarnation of Shabtai Tzvi, and he creates the most awful movement imaginable, in which he takes Avera Lishma to the most extreme. If you thought eating Yom Kippur is to the extreme, imagine the most horrible, promiscuous behavior done in the name of religion and in the name of Judaism. This is Frankism. It's an awful and horrible movement. And they engage in libel against their brother and sister Jews and create tremendous problems for the mainstream Jewish community. Eventually, Frank leads a mass conversion to Catholicism, and the Frankist movement joins the Catholic faith. Why they would want to accept them as converts, who knows? I mean, we know the answer is any Jews coming in was great, but they behaved within the Catholic Church. They continued their awful behavior. And he saw this as a continuation of Sabbateanism, like he converted to Islam. We're now going to convert to Christianity, and a really horrible movement. And they claimed to be the true Jews, and the Catholic Church had some interest in promoting them in order to stir up trouble for the Jews. And there were recorded Frankist Jewish debates. I'm almost referring to them, even though they're Jews, as almost another faith by this point. They do represent another faith by this stage. Their behavior is so radically different to classic Jewish behavior. And there are various Frankist Jewish debates arranged under the forced auspices of the Catholic Church or the King of Poland at the time. And again, we can't historically verify this, but according to some records, Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem is one of the representatives of the Jewish community in this debate. So he has perhaps become somewhat of a mainstream figure. And eventually, Mezeritch, there he dies in 1760. We do know the date of his death. We always know the dates of famous people's deaths earlier than the date of their life. Now, I want to mention one other piece of evidence that we have for the Baal Shem. I mentioned already that his tax records have been found. This is an amazing piece of Moshe Rossman's research, in which he found someone called Israel or Yisroel Baal Shem, recorded as having a reduced tax rate because he's a rabbinic figure. I want to mention one other record we have of the Baal Shem Tov still in his life, and there is a teshuvah called Mayim Chaim, written by Reb Chaim HaKohen Rappaport, who's the Rav of Ostrov, in Zitomir, and it seems in Mezeritch there was a halachic question, a matter of dispute. The Rav, basically, the Rav of Mezeritch gave a pasuk in a treifa inquiry. So there was a lesion on the lung, a very, very abstract area of halacha. There was a wound on the lung, and there was a question whether that rendered the animal non-kosher, whether it rendered the animal treif or not. And there were critics of the rabbi of Mezeritch who thought he got the pasuk wrong, and that he was inappropriately lenient. And the leaders of Mezeritch send a letter to a figure called Rav Meir, who was the Rav of Constantine. Constantine is in East Europe, not Constantinople or anything. And Constantine named after the Roman Emperor Constantine. And they send a letter to this Rav Meir of Constantine, who's the local Gadol, to ask his Pesach. He's famous for something else. He's the son of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, so he's a significant figure in his own right. And there are three signatories from the most prominent rabbinic sages of Mezeritch, and one of the signatories is Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem. So you have a beautifully written rabbinic teshuvah, an inquiry sent to the Gadol, signed by the three most distinguished leaders of Mezeritch. And we have that letter because it's published in a well-published Seforim work, and clearly Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem is prominent enough that he's one of the signatories. More than that, Rameir of Constantine replies, and he ignores the other two signatories and replies to Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem. And he writes very, very powerful rabbinic language about Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem. He addresses him as an amazing figure and writes about him in very, very flowery terms. So clearly, there is a leading posek hador in which Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem is addressed, and in which he clearly is, he's a prominent figure and deemed to be the most important figure of his generation. I have a copy of the teshuvah, but basically, Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem signs this letter, and he writes about him, Sar Yisrael, you're a prince of Israel. You are someone who's successful in everything great and small. Then he writes, you provide healing for all, indicating that Baal Shem's fame as a healer is known. He writes, you are famous in Bovel, you're well known in Severia, and as your fame is known throughout the great Talmudic academies, the Gaon Hagadol, the known for your fame, Morenu, Rabbi Yisrael, etc. And then he writes, and all your colleagues, and then he mentions basically the other two without any Torah covered at all. So he is, again, I just want to use this to mention that he's clearly a well-known figure who is prominent at the time and respected by at least some of his peers, those in the area. Is he famous beyond his area? No, absolutely not. He's not someone that people have heard of. No one's writing teshuvos to him from the other ends of the world. Why? Because teshuvos lend themselves to long-distance communication. His type of teaching doesn't. He's someone who draws figures who flock to Mezeritch, and they want to learn Torah from this new and remarkable person and figure. Okay, I want to use the remaining time available to in a sense leap out of time and go out of date, because I want us to speak about the one other record we have of the Baal Shem Tov in his life, and we're now fast forwarding, therefore, to 1750, so we're 10 years before the death of the Baal Shem. So he's at the peak of his limited fame, but drawing followers to him. And we come across a letter which is absolutely mind-blowing and is astounding and shocking. So Rabbi Yisroel Baal Shem engages in letter writing to his brother-in-law, Reb Gershon Kitova, Reb Gershon of Kitov, town in East Europe, who has meanwhile moved to Eretz Yisrael. So there's no mass aliyah, we're talking about the 1750s, but there is a trickle of Jews who moved to Eretz Yisrael. The Baal Shem Tov's second generation of students are going to lead one of the first slightly larger waves of move to Eretz Yisrael. That's the move of early Chassidim to Tiberia and Yerushalayim, the establishment of Chassidish communities in Tiberia and Yerushalayim. There is a messianic aspect to Chassidus that we will come on to, but the first generation of students of the Baal Shem Tov don't move to Eretz Yisrael by and large at all. In fact, it's the second generation that move, and the Baal Shem Tov himself obviously remains in Mezeritch, but his brother-in-law, who isn't a Talmud of the Baal Shem in the classic sense of the word, but they're brothers-in-law, they write to each other, and they seem to have very amicable relationships. Now, there are the Baal Shem is a mystic. The gap between mysticism and near prophecy is narrow. A mystic has experiences in which they have forms of divine revelation, which are not far off prophecy. We've discussed previously the Rambam himself lists 10 levels of prophecy, and as to others, there are people to this day who will claim for their great tzaddikim Ruach HaKodesh. What is Ruach HaKodesh? Some form of divine inspiration, which gives some degree of mystical insight and prophetic insight into things that are going on in the world. And the Baal Shem Tov is a mystic. He is experiencing and writing about experiences that are quasi-prophetic. And also, we will see in this letter that he is so convinced of his spiritual influence that he believes that it has the power to bring Mashiach, and says that through the spread of my Torah, eventually Mashiach will come. In other words, he believes that there's a healing aspect to his teachings that will sort of restore the world back to its spiritually perfected state, and with that, Mashiach will come. One of the Kabbalistic ideas that we'll explore next week, and that Chassidus popularizes, isn't to just see mitzvahs as commandments or instructions from Hashem, not just to see mitzvahs as things that bring to us spiritual benefit, but to see mitzvahs that bring a spiritual benefit and repair to the world. This is the L'Shem Yichud. We'll come back to that next week. In a very fragmented world in which we don't see the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through doing mitzvahs, we are reunifying the world and restoring our awareness of the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world. And in a sense, that's messianic, because that's going to prepare the world for the coming of Mashiach. So the Baal Shem Tov, at this stage in his career, is aware that there's something very unique and special about his teaching. So he's conscious of that. This isn't that he doesn't see himself as teaching a new way of looking at Torah. It's grounded. All new teaching of Torah always grounds itself in classic teachings. All new teaching of Torah only succeeds by being able to show that what I'm saying is there already inherent in Chazal and in earlier sources, but nonetheless there's much that's revolutionary about it. The Baal Shem Tov is conscious that he's founding something new. Again, this explodes another myth out there, that the Baal Shem Tov wasn't a revolutionary in any way, and it was only the next generation of students that made him into a revolutionary. We'll see from this letter that the Baal Shem Tov is conscious that he's a revolutionary. So we have three strands in Chassidus that are going to become very prominent later. The mystical strand, the prophetic strand, that it's revolutionary, and that it has messianic potential to it. Now, we can all think of one very famous Hasidic movement that becomes overtly messianic. I need to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that all or many Hasidic movements have messianic aspects to them. Lubavitch Chabad is perhaps the one that speaks most prominently about it, but even very mainstream groups of Hasidim, like Bells and so on, have messianic aspects to their theology, in which they talk about this, and it's much more widely spread amongst Hasidic groups and Hasidic thinkers than we acknowledge. What does the Baal Shem Tov say in his letter? It's an amazing letter. There's slight variant textual versions of it sent. It's possible he wrote the same letter twice, because we have a record in which he asks of Gershon Kitova, "Did you get my letter?" And Gershon Kitova says no, and he resends the letter. So it's possible we have different versions of it's possible we just have, due to copying errors, slight changes. It's possible we have two versions of the letter. But either way, the letters are deemed authentic, and he basically describes what's known as an aliyas neshama. An aliyas neshama is in meditative mystical practice, your soul leaves your body and ascends to the heavenly realms. And the Baal Shem Tov, written in this letter, written sometime around 1750, 1752, written to his brother who moved to Israel in 1747, his brother-in-law, I'm sorry, Reb Gershon of Kitov, who moved to Eretz Yisrael in 1747. He writes this letter, and it's a normal letter. He asks, how's the family doing? How's everyone going? And then he says, I want to tell you about my aliyas neshama, and basically describes a mystical experience in which his soul wanders from heavenly chamber to heavenly chamber, from realm to realm. He describes the difficulties of the aliyas neshama, the effort that's needed in order to open the gates of heaven and ascend to one place or another. And he finally says, in great pain, I encounter Mashiach. And I speak to the soul of Mashiach, and I say, Amos Kasima, when will Sir come? Now, this is a direct quote from another mystical experience described in the Gemara. The Gemara describes a rabbinic figure meeting Mashiach. This time, Mashiach is there at the gates of Rome and is a pauper, and he says to Mashiach, Amos Kasima, when will Sir come? And Mashiach responded, Hayom, I'm coming today. And he's very excited. Mashiach's coming today, and he says, "Yeah, Hayom." And quotes the pasuk in Tishmu L'Koili. If you listen to my voice, the pasuk in Sefer Devarim. If you listen to my voice, then Mashiach will come. I'll come whenever you're ready. The Mashiach answers the Baal Shem Tov's question, "When are you coming?" And he said, "When your well springs are spread, when the whole world knows your Torah, then Mashiach will come." In other words, your Torah is vital for the world, and part of the fervor of Chassidus to this day, and the missionizing zeal of Chassidus, is because they genuinely believe that this is Torah that has to be heard by the world. And until the whole world is suffused with the light of Chassidus, they often refer to Rabbi Zobin as Yisroel, the light of Israel. That's a general rabbinic title that's often used for great rabbis, but they often use this in particular. And basically he says, until your Torah is spread through the world, once your Torah is known throughout the world, only then will Mashiach be able to come. Your Torah is vital. That the spiritual light of your Torah is so powerful that it's necessary to bring the world back to a state of healing. Yes. I don't know. Not sure. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't finish his revelation. The revelation finishes as Mashiach answers because once the well springs of your Torah are known, etc. So we don't know how far this was taken, and there were things he didn't want to reveal to his brother-in-law, and this is part of, again, the Chabad idea of spreading Chassidus to everyone and wanting everyone to know Chassidus. The Shlichus model, the online presence they have, the use of technology from a very early stage, satellite broadcasts, the filming of everything the Rebbe said, this idea of spreading Chassidic teachings as widely as possible, and as you're saying, even the non-Jewish world needs to be touched by the Torah of the Baal Shem Tov. So what we need to, we'll conclude at this point, what we need to now go forward with is, okay, so what is the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov? Why is it so powerful? Why does it capture? I want to emphasize over here, there's nothing in the least arrogant about this point of the Baal Shem Tov. He's a mystic who believes his mysticism has a power to change the world, and it does have that power. His belief is proven because he attracts to himself some of the greatest rabbinic leaders of his generation, who then go on and revolutionize the whole Jewish world, and until Chassidus speaks to the soul of perhaps close to, if not already now, the majority of Orthodox Jews. So we have to understand what is the great light of Chassidus. That's Mitzvah Shem, what we will look at next Sunday. Mitzvah Shem. Yes, Avram. There are already Talmudic Gemara sources to the concept of Avera Lishma. For example, Yoel, the Eish Zakeni, the descendant of Yisroel, who seduces Sisera and gets him drunk and kills him, seems to do an Avera Lishma in order to achieve success. Esther Hamalka, right, in Yona's Yoma, we've got a poem coming up in a couple of days. Mordechai says to her, enter the chamber of the king, and you need to appeal to the king, and she's reluctant to do so. According to the Gemara, one of the reasons she's reluctant to do so is because she is presenting herself to the king and making herself available to him in a manner which she's never done until now. She's always been a reluctant spouse and partner of the king, and for the first time she's setting out to appeal to him, to attract him. Throughout the whole sort of beauty pageant and everything else, she's always been a passive recipient of the king's favors. Now, for the first time, she's setting out to seduce the king. And that's Chazal's understanding of HaTanya, imovadati ovadati. If I'm lost, I'm lost. If I'm sacrificing my soul, so be it. I'm doing that for the sake of the Jewish people. So the concept of Avera Lishma is one that we'll have to explore. One second, please, just 1 second. The concept of Avera Lishma is one that we'll have to explore in future weeks. And there are elements of that, perhaps, in Chassidus. There's a lot of controversy about this. And it's a dangerous idea. It's a Pandora's box. It clearly needs to be worked out and understood what we mean by this idea. The fact that the Gemara tells it to us in rare occasions for the salvation of the whole Jewish people is a far cry from a more common application of the principle. Shabtai Tzvi and then Jacob Frank take it to the most bizarre and obscene extremes. Chassidus is accused of aspects of it, and there may be truth in that accusation. That may be part of the opposition around Chassidus. Yeah, I'll take you and then, yeah. Yes.
Why you?
Yeah.
Asking that many graduates of why you go become chaplains in the military, even though they know feel that they have to be Mechayel Shabbat, maybe in actually eating kashrut, but they should put themselves in that position.
Okay, so this is a different concept. There are halachic mechanisms where you can put yourself in a situation where you will now be oines, and to save your life, you'll have to be Mechal Shabbos or eat non-kosher food. There's a big question: to what degree are you allowed to put yourself in a position where you will then be unable to do mitzvahs or have to do averos? But that's different because once I'm in that position, I now have halachic framework to justify doing what I'm doing. Question is, can I put myself in that position? So, for example, there's a famous halacha: you're not meant to. Okay, I'll leave the halacha. We're running out of time, and I want to give them a chance to speak. Yeah.
Very quick, is this Yehuda's Tzorech Le'aliyah? Is that the basis of that?
It's a separate concept. We'll come to you. We may mention also you did Tzorech Aliyah. Yeah. The problem with this is it's a much more dramatic concept. It's an idea of literally doing something against halacha in order to achieve a spiritual goal. And it really makes us question what is the purpose of halacha? What is halacha? What is spirituality? And we'll come back to that. And I'm delighted to say we will come back to the figure of Gaon also in this conversation. So linking, I will mention, just if we want a conclusion, there are Hasidic traditions that the Baal ShemTov claimed that he was a Gilgal, a reincarnation of the Gaon. When you make a claim like that, you are saying there's something in my spirituality that in some way or other connects to the spirituality of the Gaon. Really, really interesting. Someone asked about whether the Baal ShemTov was educated in classic secular studies. I don't know. I have my own. I've never seen this in any academic work. I have my own pieces of evidence that Yisroel Baal Shem certainly studied classic Jewish philosophy. He didn't just study Kabbalah. That he knew works like Emunah V'Deus. So that's my own. I've never seen this written, but I'll present next week some evidence that the Baal Shem Tov knew classic non-Kabbalistic Jewish philosophy. Okay, so we'll stop here for today, and I wish everyone a good morning. Thank you so much.